A Thief at the National Zoo, Chapter 2. Creepy Fingers in the Dark. At 7 o'clock, Casey and Marshall were back at the zoo. They came with the president and Casey's mom Lois in the presidential car. Two other cars followed, each held 4 Secret Service agents. The president was wearing a tuxedo. Lois wore a long white dress, a flower tucked into her hair. Casey and Marshall wore their best dress-up clothes. Dr. Tutu was waiting at the entrance of the zoo. He had dressed in a black tuxedo and white shirt, and he carried his leather briefcase. "Good evening, Mr. and Mrs. President," Dr. Tutu said. He escorted them and the President's Secret Service agents through the empty zoo to a room near where Casey and Marshall had played with the tiger cubs. There were about 25 well-dressed people already there. Waiters carried trays of food and drink across the thick red carpet. A crystal chandelier cast a soft light. Music came from a pair of speakers mounted on the walls. When the president and Lois entered, everyone clapped. The Secret Service agents moved into the room and stopped where they could keep an eye on the president and his family. "Look, Casey, there's Sun Wu and her parents," Marshall said. Sun Wu and her mother wore matching yellow dresses. Sun Wu had a small purse with a thin gold chain slung over one shoulder. Her father was dressed in a tuxedo, like most men in the room. "Let's go say hi," Casey said. Casey and Marshall walked across the deep carpet. Sun Wu saw them coming and smiled. "Mother, father, these are my new friends," Sun Wu said. "Casey and Marshall. These are my parents, Mr. and Mrs. Chu." They all shook hands. "I enjoyed meeting with your stepfather," Mr. Chu told Casey. He winked. "And I like your big white house." Marshall glanced around the room. "Is the tiger's eye here?" he whispered to Sun Wu. Sun Wu nodded. "Father, I told them about it," she said. "Can you show them?" Sun Wu's father was carrying a small black box with a tiger painted on the lid. Mr. Chu opened the box and removed a square of red silk. Nestled at the bottom of the box was a round, yellowish object the size of a baseball. The roughly shaped emerald inside seemed to float in the amber. Casey stared at the emerald through the amber covering. The green gem appeared to glow. She had never seen anything so old or mysterious. "Is it worth a lot of money?" Marshall asked. "To the Chinese people, the tiger's eye is priceless," Mr. Chu said. "We would not sell it for all of the money in the world." Dr. Tutu approached Sun Wu's father. "If you're ready, Mr. Chu," he said. Dr. Tutu led Mr. Chu to a corner of the room, where a table stood near the door. A velvet cloth lay in the center of the table. Mr. Chu placed the black box on the cloth. Dr. Tutu set his briefcase on the floor and nudged it under the table with his foot. "Good evening, everyone," Dr. Tutu said. "We are here tonight to accept a generous gift from this gentleman, Mr. Chen Chu. As you all know, many species of tigers are now extinct or endangered. Mr. Chu's gift will help this zoo find more ways to protect the world's tigers. Mr. Chu has also brought a surprise from his country." All eyes went to the black box on the table. "But first, Mr. Chu's daughter, Sun Wu, will give the tiger cubs their official name," Dr. Tutu added. He motioned for Sun Wu to join him and her father. Everyone in the room smiled and looked at Sun Wu. "Come up here with me," Sun Wu whispered to Casey and Marshall. "This is very embarrassing." Casey looked at Marshall and nodded. They joined Sun Wu at the next table. Dr. Tutu pulled a walkie-talkie from a clip on his belt and spoke into it. A moment later, the door opened and Derek came in carrying Lucy and Ricky. He stood behind Casey holding the cubs so everyone could see their cute faces. Casey felt a sneeze coming on. Maybe she was allergic to tigers after all. She held her breath and squeezed her eyes shut. "Please," she thought, "don't let me sneeze now in the middle of the ceremony." There were a lot of oohs and ahs as the guests admired the baby Sumatran tigers. Dr. Tutu smiled at Sun Wu. "Have you picked the names?" he asked. "Yes," Sun Wu said. "My family has chosen Indonesian names because these are Sumatran tigers. The boy tiger will be Guntur. That is the Indonesian word for thunder. We have named the girl Melati, which means jasmine blossom." Everyone clapped again. Those are fine names, Dr. Tutu said. Thank you, Sun Wu, for... Suddenly, the lights went out, and the room was pitch dark. For a few seconds, there was total silence. Then everyone began talking at once. I can't see a thing, one woman cried. What should we do? Please remain calm, Dr. Tutu called out into the black room. We seem to have lost power, but I'm sure it will be back on in a moment. Just as Casey turned to say something to Marshall, someone bumped into her, nearly knocking her off her feet. She reached out into the dark and kept trying to keep from falling. She felt the table, and then her fingers touched a human hand. Startled, she pulled her own hands back. Then she sneezed 3 times in a row. Next to Casey, Dr. Tutu began speaking to someone through his walkie-talkie. Casey heard people moving around, jostling into each other in the dark. A few people were laughing like it was a party game. Casey heard some of the Secret Service agents urgently talking to each other about POTUS. POTUS was their code word for her stepfather. The letter stood for President of the United States. Casey had a scary thought. What if the lights going out were part of a kidnapping plot? What is going on? Marshall said into Casey's ear. Beats me, Casey answered. Just stand still or you'll get trampled. The lights came back on. Casey blinked in the sudden brightness. She looked up and saw Derek holding Ricky and Lucy, one in each hand. They were squirming and hissing. Their little legs were clawing the air. Casey turned around and tried to find her mother and the president. She spotted them near a far wall surrounded by Secret Service agents. Casey's mother waved. Sun Wu stood between her parents. What happened? She asked her father. Just a power failure, Mr. Chu said. Then he patted his daughter's hand. Now you see why we need your donations, Dr. Tutu joked to the crowd. Everyone laughed. Before the lights went out, I was going to ask Mr. Chu to tell us about his special surprise, Dr. Tutu continued. Mr. Chu placed his hand on the black box. He told everyone how the amber-covered emerald had been found 2,000 years ago. When visitors come to China, they want to see the Great Wall first. Then they go to the Imperial Palace to see this tiger's eye. Mr. Chu placed his hand on the box. I brought it to Washington, D.C. to bring luck to the people, he said. Then the people will bring luck to the tigers. Mr. Chu lifted the lid on the box, facing toward the crowd so everyone could see the tiger's eye. Casey looked at the box. Except for a small silk cloth, it was empty. Someone giggled nervously. Dr. Tutu and Mr. Chu stared into the box. To Casey, they seemed frozen, as if they'd been playing statues. The tiger's eye is gone, Mr. Chu said.